Western imperialism in Asia as presented in this article pertains to Western European entry into what was first called the East Indies. This was sparked early in the 15th century by the search for trade routes to China that led directly to the Age of Discovery, and the introduction of early modern warfare into what was then called the Far East. By the early 16th century, the Age of Sail greatly expanded Western European influence and development of the spice trade under colonialism. There has been a presence of Western European colonial empires and imperialism in Asia throughout 6 centuries of colonialism, formally ending with the independence of the Portuguese Empire's last colony East Timor in 2002. The empires introduced Western concepts of nation and the multinational state. This article attempts to outline the consequent development of the Western concept of the nation-state. The thrust of European political power, commerce, and culture in Asia gave rise to growing trade in commodities, a key development in the rise of today's modern world free market economy. In the 16th century, the Portuguese broke the monopoly of the Arabs and Italians of trade between Asia and Europe by the discovery of the sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope. With the ensuing rise of the rival Dutch East India Company, Portuguese influence in Asia was gradually eclipsed. Dutch forces first established independent bases in the east and then between 1640 and 1660 wrestled Malacca, Ceylon, some southern Indian ports, and the lucrative Japan trade from the Portuguese. Later, the English and the French established settlements in India and established a trade with China, and their own acquisitions would gradually surpass those of the Dutch. Following the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the British eliminated French influence in India and established the British East India Company as the most important political force on the Indian subcontinent. Before the Industrial Revolution in the mid to late 19th century, demand for Oriental goods such as remained the driving force behind European imperialism, and the European stake in Asia remained confined largely to trading stations and strategic outposts necessary to protect trade. Industrialization, however, dramatically increased European demand for Asian raw materials, and the severe Long Depression of the 1870s provoked a scramble for new markets for European industrial products and financial services in Africa, the Americas, Eastern Europe, and especially in Asia. This scramble coincided with a new era in global colonial expansion known as the New Imperialism, which saw a shift in focus from trade and indirect rule to formal colonial control of vast overseas territories ruled as political extensions of their mother countries. Between the 1870s and the beginning of World War I in 1914, the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands, the established colonial powers in Asia, added to their empires vast expanses of territory in the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. In the same period, the Empire of Japan, following the Meiji Restoration, the German Empire, following the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, Tsarist Russia, and the United States, following the Spanish-American War in 1898, quickly emerged as new imperial powers in East Asia and in the Pacific Ocean area. In Asia, World War I and World War II were played out as struggles among several key imperial powers, conflicts involving the European powers along with Russia, and the rising American and Japanese powers. None of the colonial powers, however, possessed the resources to withstand the strains of both world wars and maintain their direct rule in Asia. Although nationalist movements throughout the colonial world led to the political independence of nearly all of the Asia's remaining colonies, decolonization was intercepted by the Cold War, and Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and East Asia remained embedded in a world economic, financial, and military system in which the great powers compete to extend their influence. However, the rapid post-war economic development of the East Asian tigers, India, the People's Republic of China, along with the collapse of the Soviet Union, have loosened European and American influence in Asia, generating speculation today about emergence of modern India and China as potential superpowers. Early European exploration of Asia. European exploration of Asia started in ancient Roman times. Knowledge of lands as distant as China were held by the Romans. Trade with India through the Roman-Egyptian Red Sea ports was significant in the first centuries of the Common Era. Medieval European exploration of Asia in the 13th and 14th centuries. A number of Europeans, many of them Christian missionaries, had sought to penetrate into China. The most famous of these travelers was Marco Polo. But these journeys had little permanent effect on East-West trade because of a series of political developments in Asia in the last decades of the 14th century, which put an end to further European exploration of Asia. The Yuan dynasty in China, which had been receptive to European missionaries and merchants, was overthrown, and the new Ming rulers were found to be unreceptive of religious proselytism. Meanwhile, the Turks consolidated control over the eastern Mediterranean, closing off key overland trade routes. Thus, until the 15th century, only minor trade and cultural exchanges between Europe and Asia continued at certain terminals controlled by Muslim traders. Oceanic voyages to Asia. Western European rulers determined to find new trade routes of their own. The Portuguese spearheaded the drive to find oceanic routes that would provide cheaper and easier access to South and East Asian goods. This chartering of oceanic routes between East and West began with the unprecedented voyages of Portuguese and Spanish sea captains. Their voyages were influenced by medieval European adventurers, who had journeyed overland to the Far East and contributed to geographical knowledge of parts of Asia upon their return. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa under the sponsorship of Portugal's John II, from which point he noticed that the coast swung northeast. While Diaz' crew forced him to turn back by 1497, Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama made the first open voyage from Europe to India. In 1520, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator in the service of Spain, found a sea route into the Pacific Ocean. Portuguese and Spanish trade and colonization in Asia. Portuguese monopoly over trade in the Indian Ocean and Asia. Early in the 16th century, Afonso de Albuquerque emerged as the Portuguese colonial viceroy, most instrumental in consolidating Portugal's holdings in Africa and in Asia. He understood that Portugal could wrest commercial supremacy from the Arabs only by force, and therefore devised a plan to establish forts at strategic sites which would dominate the trade routes and also protect Portuguese interests on land. In 1510, he conquered Goa in India, which enabled him to gradually consolidate control of most of the commercial traffic between Europe and Asia. Largely through trade, Europeans started to carry on trade from forts, acting as foreign merchants rather than as settlers. In contrast, early European expansion in the West Indies, following the 1492 voyage of Christopher Columbus, involved heavy settlement in colonies that were treated as political extensions of the mother countries. Lured by the potential of high profits from another expedition, the Portuguese established a permanent base south of the Indian trade port of Calicut in the early 15th century. In 1510, the Portuguese seized Goa on the coast of India, which Portugal held until 1961. The Portuguese soon acquired a monopoly over trade in the Indian Ocean. Portuguese Viceroy Afonso de Albuquerque resolved to consolidate Portuguese holdings in Africa and Asia, and secure control of trade with the East Indies and China. His first objective was Malacca, which controlled the narrow strait through which most Far Eastern trade moved. Captured in 1511, Malacca became the springboard for further eastward penetration. Several years later, the first trading posts were established in the Moluccas. or Spice Islands, which was the source for some of the world's most hotly demanded spices. By 1516, the first Portuguese ships had reached Canton on the southern coasts of China. In 1513, after the failed attempt to conquer Aden, Albuquerque entered with an armada, for the first time for Europeans by the ocean via, on the Red Sea, and in 1515, Albuquerque consolidated the Portuguese hegemony in the Persian Gulf Gates, already begun by him in 1507, with the domain of Muscat and Ormuz. The Portuguese conquest of Malacca triggered the Malayan-Portuguese War. In 1521, Ming Dynasty China defeated the Portuguese at the Battle of Tunman and then defeated the Portuguese again at the Battle of Sisawin. China defeated the Portuguese in Quanzhou and in Ningbo, totally driving the Portuguese off of China's southeastern coast in the 1530s-1540s. In 1557, China decided to lease Macau to the Portuguese as a place where they could dry goods they transported on their ships, which they held until 1999. The Portuguese, based at Goa and Malacca, had now established a lucrative maritime empire in the Indian Ocean meant to monopolize the spice trade. The Portuguese also began a channel of trade with the Japanese, becoming the first recorded Westerners to have visited Japan. This contact introduced Christianity and firearms into Japan. The energies of Spain, the other major colonial power of the 16th century, were largely concentrated on the Americas, not South and East Asia, but the Spanish did establish a footing in the Far East in the Philippines. After 1565, cargoes of Chinese goods were transported from the Philippines to Mexico and from there to Spain. By this long route, Spain reaped some of the profits of Far Eastern commerce. Spanish officials converted the islands to Christianity and established some settlements, permanently establishing the Philippines as the area of East Asia most oriented toward the West in terms of culture and commerce. The Moro-Muslims fought against the Spanish for over 3 centuries in the Spanish-Moro conflict. Decline of Portugal's Asian empire. Since the 17th century, the lucrative trade was vastly expanded when the Portuguese began to export slaves from Africa in 1541. However, over time, the rise of the slave trade left Portugal overextended and vulnerable to competition from other Western European powers. Envious of Portugal's control of trade routes, other Western European nations, mainly the Netherlands, France, and England, began to send in rival expeditions to Asia. In 1642, the Dutch drove the Portuguese out of the Gold Coast in Africa, the source of the bulk of Portuguese slave laborers, leaving this rich slaving area to other Europeans, especially the Dutch and the English. Rival European powers began to make inroads in Asia as the Portuguese and Spanish trade in the Indian Ocean declined, primarily because they had become hugely overstretched financially due to the limitations on their investment capacity and contemporary naval technology. Both of these factors worked in tandem, making control over Indian Ocean trade extremely expensive. The existing Portuguese interests in Asia proved sufficient to finance further colonial expansion and entrenchment in areas regarded as of greater strategic importance in Africa and Brazil. Portuguese maritime supremacy was lost to the Dutch in the 17th century, and with this came serious challenges for the Portuguese. However, they still clung to Macau, and settled a new colony on the island of Timor. It was as recent as the 1960s and 1970s that the Portuguese began to relinquish their colonies in Asia. Goa was invaded by India in 1961 and became an Indian state in 1987. Portuguese Timor was abandoned in 1975 and was then invaded by Indonesia. It became an independent country in 2002, and Macau was handed back to the Chinese as per a treaty in 1999. Dutch trade and colonization in Asia. Rise of Dutch control over Asian trade. In the 17th century, Portuguese decline in Asia was accelerated by the attacks on their commercial empire by the Dutch and the English, which began a global struggle over empire in Asia that lasted until the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. The Netherlands' revolt against Spanish rule facilitated Dutch encroachment of the Portuguese monopoly over South and East Asian trade. The Dutch looked on Spain's trade and colonies as potential spoils in war. When the two crowns of the Iberian Peninsula were joined in 1581, the Dutch felt free to attack Portuguese territories in Asia. By the 1590s, a number of Dutch companies were formed to finance trading expeditions in Asia. Because competition lowered their profits, and because of the doctrines of mercantilism. In 1602 the companies united into a cartel and formed the Dutch East India Company, and received from the government the right to trade in colonized territory in the area stretching from the Cape of Good Hope eastward to the Strait of Magellan. In 1605, armed Dutch merchants captured the Portuguese fort at Amboina in the Moluccas, which was developed into the first secure base of the company. Over time, the Dutch gradually consolidated control over the great trading ports of the East Indies. Control over the East Indies trading ports allowed the company to monopolize the world's spice trade for decades. Their monopoly over the spice trade became complete after they drove the Portuguese from Malacca in 1641 and Ceylon in 1658. Dutch East India Company colonies or outposts were later established in Aceh (1667), Makassar (1669), and Bantam (1682). The company established its headquarters at Batavia on the island of Java. Outside the East Indies, the Dutch East India Company colonies or outposts were also established in Persia, Bengal, Mauritius, Siam, Guangzhou, Taiwan, and southern India. Ming Dynasty China defeated the Dutch East India Company in the Sino-Dutch conflicts. The Chinese first defeated and drove the Dutch out of the Pescadores in 1624. The Ming Navy under Zheng Zhilong defeated the Dutch East India Company's fleet at the 1633 Battle of Liaoluo Bay. In 1662, Zheng Zhilong's son Zheng Chenglong expelled the Dutch from Taiwan after defeating them in the siege of Fort Zeelandia. Further, the Dutch East India Company trade post on Dejima, an artificial island off the coast of Nagasaki, was for a long time the only place where Europeans could trade with Japan. The Vietnamese Nguyen lords defeated the Dutch in a naval battle in 1643. The Cambodians defeated the Dutch in the Cambodian-Dutch War in 1644. In 1652, Jan van Riebeeck established an outpost at the Cape of Good Hope to restock company ships on their journey to East Asia. This post later became a fully fledged colony, the Cape Colony. As Cape Colony attracted increasing Dutch and European settlement, the Dutch founded the city of Capstad. By 1669, the Dutch East India Company was the richest private company in history, with a huge fleet of merchant ships and warships, tens of thousands of employees, a private army consisting of thousands of soldiers, and a reputation on the part of its stockholders for high dividend payments. Dutch new imperialism in Asia. The company was in almost constant conflict with the English. Relations were particularly tense following the Amboina massacre in 1623. During the 18th century, Dutch East India Company possessions were increasingly focused on the East Indies. After the Fourth War between the United Provinces and England, the company suffered increasing financial difficulties. In 1799, the company was dissolved, commencing official colonization of the East Indies. During the era of new imperialism, the territorial claims of the Dutch East India Company expanded into a fully fledged colony named the Dutch East Indies. Partly driven by renewed colonial aspirations of fellow European nation-states, the Dutch strived to establish unchallenged control of the archipelago now known as Indonesia. 6 years into formal colonization of the East Indies, in Europe the Dutch Republic was occupied by the French forces of Napoleon. The Dutch government went into exile in England and formally ceded its colonial possessions to Great Britain. The pro-French Governor-General of Java Jan Willem Janssens resisted a British invasion force in 1811 until forced to surrender. British Governor Raffles, who later founded the city of Singapore, ruled the colony the following 10 years of the British interregnum. After the defeat of Napoleon and the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814, colonial government of the East Indies was ceded back to the Dutch in 1817. The loss of South Africa and the continued scramble for Africa stimulated the Dutch to secure unchallenged dominion over its colony in the East Indies. The Dutch started to consolidate its power base through extensive military campaigns and elaborate diplomatic alliances with indigenous rulers, ensuring the Dutch tricolour was firmly planted in all corners of the archipelago. These military campaigns included the Padri War, the Java War and the Aceh War. This raised the need for a considerable military build-up of the colonial army. From all over Europe soldiers were recruited to join the KNIL. The Dutch concentrated their colonial enterprise in the Dutch East Indies throughout the 19th century. The Dutch lost control over the East Indies to the Japanese during much of World War II. Following the war, the Dutch fought Indonesian independence forces after Japan surrendered to the Allies in 1945. In 1949 most of what was known as the Dutch East Indies was ceded to the Independent Republic of Indonesia. In 1962 also Dutch New Guinea was annexed by Indonesia, de facto ending Dutch imperialism in Asia.